So my story really began when I was 13, when a close family friend who's like an uncle to me actually passed from pancreatic cancer. And when the disease hit so close to home, I knew I needed to learn more. So I went online to find answers. And using tools such as Google and Wikipedia, I found a variety of statistics on pancreatic cancer. And what I had found really shocked me. You see, over 85% of all these cancers are diagnosed late, when someone has less than a 2% chance of survival. And digging deeper, I found out that the reason for this was even more shocking. You see, our current test for pancreatic cancer is a 60-year-old technique. I mean, first off, that's older than my dad, but also it costs $800 per test, and is grossly inaccurate, missing 30% of all cancers. Your doctor would have to be ridiculously suspicious that you had the cancer in order to give you this test. So learning this, I was sure there had to be a better way, so armed with 9th grade biology, I set out to change the field of cancer diagnostics, a bit lofty of a goal. However, I was going to do it. And upon further research, I found out what a center for pancreatic cancer would really have to look like in order to be effective. The center would have to be inexpensive, rapid, simple, sensitive, selective, and minimally invasive. And I was pretty sure I could do this, however, I wasn't quite sure how. And upon more research, I found out the main reason why we haven't really advanced our pancreatic cancer diagnostics is because when we're looking for the cancer, we're looking at your bloodstream, particularly for these variations in protein levels. And while this sounds very straightforward, it's anything but. You see, there are liters and liters of blood that are abundant in protein already, and you're looking for this minuscule difference in this tiny amount of protein. It's next to impossible. It's like trying to find a needle in a stack of nearly identical needles. However, undeterred due to my teenage optimism, or how some people label it, complete and utter ignorance of the entire field, I went back to my best friend Google and Wikipedia, and I found a database of over 8,000 proteins that are found in your bloodstream when you have these cancers. And it was summer break. I had nothing else to do. My schedule was clear. So I shut myself in my room, and over the course of that summer, I went through every single one of those proteins. By the end of the summer, I was really doubting my potential for any future social interactions, and made for some interesting back-to-school essays. My teacher would be like, "What did you do this summer?" And so my friend was like, "Oh, I went to Yellowstone." And they were like, "Jack, what did you do?" "I researched proteins." And so, however, eventually on the 4,000th try, I struck gold, and I found a protein that could potentially work. The name of this protein is called mesothelin, and it's just your ordinary run-of-the-mill type protein, unless you have pancreatic, ovarian, and lung cancer, in which case it's found at these very high levels in your bloodstream. But the key is that it's found in the earliest stages of the disease, when someone has close to 100% chance of survival. So now that I found a protein that could work, I then shifted my focus to actually detecting this protein and thus the detection of pancreatic cancer. And on this long, epic saga that was me finding a new way to detect pancreatic cancer, I had one epiphany moment. And it came in the most unlikely of places. High school biology class, the absolute stifler of innovation. Particularly with my biology teacher, we didn't get along whatsoever. It was kind of like all out war by the end of the year. And it reached the point one day where I rebelled like any teenager would. I stuck in an article on single-walled carbon nanotubes, some actual hard science. And I was reading all about these amazing properties, and a carbon nanotube, these are these long, thin tubes of carbon that are an atom thick, and they're 150,000th the diameter of a single strand of hair. So they're extremely small, and they have these incredible properties. They're kind of like the superheroes of material science. So while I was feeling really suave, sneaking in the center of my desk, feeling really cool, I was kind of being droned to sleep by my biology teacher's monotonous voice. And she was lecturing us on antibodies. And antibodies are this certain class of interesting molecules. They only react with one specific protein. In this case, that cancer biomarker I was looking at, mesothelin. And so now that I was like thinking, how am I going to combine these two things? The antibodies, they're really selective. And in a biological assay, what you want is selectivity, which the antibodies would provide, such that it say you have pancreatic cancer, you don't want the sensor to go off if you have a cut. However, also, you want sensitivity such that you detect all of the cancers. And that's what the carbon nanotube would provide. So all of a sudden it hit me. You could combine these two concepts. You essentially take this antibody and you weave it into this network of nanotubes, such that you have a network that only reacts with one specific protein. But also, due to the properties of these nanotubes, this network will actually change how electricity flows through it based on the amount of protein present, and thus indicate pancreatic cancer. And I could detect this electrical change using an ohm meter I snatched from my dad's garage that we got from Home Depot. And just as soon as I had this kind of epiphany moment, my biology teacher, I swear she has eyes on the back of her head. She whirls around, red in the face. She spots me reading that article. She storms up, snatches it out of my hands, like, what is this actual science doing in my classroom for the mundane regurgitation? At least that's what I thought she said. However, after class, after 30 minutes of being lectured on how to respect myself and others, I finally got my article back, and that was really all I wanted from her. I had no other reason to ever talk to her. She was actually very mean to me. And eventually, I then got back to my house, and I could begin researching more on this promising idea I had. And then I realized, well, these carbon nanotube networks are really flimsy, and since they're so delicate, they need to be supported. So I chose to use paper for this. And making a paper sensor for pancreatic cancer is about as simple as making cookies, which I personally love, especially if I did bad on a test. Depending on how bad, I might add a bit of ice cream in there as well. However, what you do is you start with some water, you pour in some nanotubes, add some add some antibody, you mix it up, take some paper, dip it, dry it, and you can detect cancer. Pretty simple. However, that might be an oversimplification. There's a few other steps to that. But as soon as I had this epiphany moment, I realized I'm going to need a lab. I can't do cancer research on my kitchen countertop, unfortunately. That wasn't in the house budget. I mean, my brother and me had done some very interesting scientific expeditions in our house. We have cooked up high-grade explosives in our basement. We also cultured E. coli and salmonella and cholera, where we make sandwiches. Luckily, we didn't have a breakout. And me and my brother even ordered some uranium from a few sketchy Russian websites. It's sitting in our basement. That landed us on the FBI watch list. But you can't really blame us. It was 50% off. I mean, that was a great deal. However, I was going to need a lab for this, and so I went and I typed up this 32-page behemoth of a document. I shot it out to 200 professors at Johns Hopkins University. I was sure I was going to get into every single one of those labs, hailed as like super genius kid saves us from cancer. Then reality hit. Got 199 rejections. I realized some university professors aren't nearly as nice as those glowing profile pictures of them smiling make them seem. They can actually be very mean sometimes, marking up an entire procedure in red ink. I really had no clue where they got all of that time to go through each step and say why it was the worst mistake I could get. Maybe it was a hobby, putting down 16-year-olds. However, eventually I got into the lab of Dr. Andraka. He finally said, okay, kid, you can come in for this interview. So I go in for this big interview with Dr. Maitra at Johns Hopkins University. And I suppose sweatpants and a hoodie wasn't the best interview attire. However, what happened is after an hour-long interrogation where he crammed 28 PhDs plus me into one tiny 3-meter by 3-meter room, I finally got the lab space I needed. I guessed on quite a few of those questions they asked me. I always guess C like I do on my SATs. I mean, what other answer could there be? However, I got into the lab, and 7 months later, I ended up with one small paper sensor that costs 3 cents and takes 5 minutes to run. This makes it 168 times faster, over 26,000 times less expensive, and over 400 times more sensitive than our current methods of detection. But also, the key is that it can detect the cancer in the earliest stage, when someone has close to 100% chance of survival, and so far is over 90% accuracy at detecting the cancer. So in the next 2 to 5 years, this patent-pending sensor could potentially lift the once dismal pancreatic cancer survival rates from 5.5% to close to 100%. And it would do similar for ovarian and lung cancer. But it wouldn't stop there. By switching out that antibody, you can detect an entirely different protein, meaning an entirely different disease, ranging from Alzheimer's to other forms of cancer, even HIV, AIDS, and heart disease. The possibilities are literally endless. And throughout this journey, I faced a lot of difficulties. I mean, I screwed up in that lab so many times. I mean, first day, I walk in, and they're like, culture some cancer cells for us. And I'm like, oh, that's easy. I sneezed in my culture flask, and I thought, cancer, it's pretty hard to kill. I mean, like, it's an immune system or something. No, there are tentacles growing out, and all of my cells were dead. And then, over the course of that 7 months, I also committed cellular genocide, probably. I blew them up in the centrifuge in this really glorious fountain. I mean, there is cell media everywhere. I thought it was totally worth it. My lab mentor, not so much. However, what happened is one of the greatest struggles I faced on this entire journey was not necessarily screwing up in the lab or being rejected from endless labs, or even coming up with the idea or being rejected by not only my parents, but also my biology teacher. It was paywalls. You see, scientific paywalls are these things that prevent you from getting access to articles. You essentially have to cough up $35 every time you want to read an article. And for a young scientist like me, these little increments of $35 can add up pretty quickly. I mean, when you need 200 articles to really get a background basis, that's a couple $1,000s you're spending there. And so we've essentially created this barrier between the public and science using these scientific paywalls, particularly for the youth. And we see all these big STEM initiatives that say, oh, we need more youth interested in STEM. But there's a bit of a mixed message being communicated when the new Katy Perry single costs 99 cents and a seminal science article costs $35. I mean, which one are you going to choose there? But this isn't just a problem for 15-year-old cancer researchers. This is a problem for everyone. You see, recently, Harvard University released a statement saying that subscriptions to major periodical journals, particularly to electronic subscribers, cannot be sustained. Continuing these subscriptions is financially untenable. Now, what does it say about the world of academic publishing, accessibility of knowledge, and the flow of information when Harvard University, the richest academic institution in the world, can't afford to continue paying for its research? So we've essentially created this very rigid class system with these paywalls. You see, we have the knowledge elite, those that have access to these articles, those big labs and big universities, but even here there's a bit of a social stratification. You see, big universities like Harvard and Stanford and Yale probably have a lot more funding than the local state university. And so it's essentially saying, okay, the top 10 schools, you all can teach beyond calculus. Everyone else, you're limited to algebra. That's it. Too bad for you if you can't afford it. And then there's the knowledge middle class, people like you or I. We can get on the internet, we might buy a few articles, and we can look at the 10% of articles that are open access, free to the public. But then there's the knowledge underclass, those 5.5 billion people who don't have access to the internet whatsoever, and so are completely malnourished almost when it comes to knowledge. And we're living in a knowledge aristocracy where 0.008% of the population, that's how many people can read these articles. And so that's like taking the entire population of New York City, we take 80 people out of those 10 million people, just 80, and we say, only you can read these articles, no one else. And for all of you other guys, you can't do science whatsoever. You guys just don't have the education or intelligence to do that. And then we have 80% of the population, 5.5 billion people, who can't access the information whatsoever. I mean, that's ridiculous. However, imagine if we could live in a knowledge democracy where no matter where you are from, whether it's from Cambodia to China, Mexico to Malaysia, whether you're a billionaire or living on less than $1 a day, you'd have the exact same access to these articles. Because knowledge should not be a commodity, and scientific knowledge should be a basic human right. And the minds of the people must be free, and that means the minds of everyone, not the minds of the select few who can afford these articles. And I believe that we can institute this change, because think, if a 15-year-old who didn't quite know what a pancreas was could find a new way to detect pancreatic cancer, just imagine what we all can do together. Thank you.
Jack, I'm actually going to break all the rules of Bold Talks. I'm going to say, do you have a bit more? Because we love listening to you. Can you give us another 10 minutes? Because I think the biggest challenge you face now is how do you get this test into production? Tell us about the commercial realities. The other challenge, you spoke about the research challenge. Tell us about the commercial challenge of how you get this into production. Can you speak for 10 minutes on that? Because we'd love to hear. Or on other aspects of the project. Tell us a bit more. We'd love to hear, truly. The floor is yours, really.
Oh dear, okay. We'll try this out. Might not be as rehearsed as the first bit of my talk. However, so right now where the project stands is I currently have the international patent on the technology, and that was a giant challenge in itself. I mean, right before I entered this big science fair, I essentially put in a patent, and it didn't have any claims or anything else. It was me just saying, this is what I invented. And after the science fair, when I had won it, I finally was just like, okay, I should probably get a patent lawyer or something. This needs to be actually legit. And she just kind of like cried when she looked at it. She's like, what is this? So what happens is I currently have this patent after striving and working and like putting tears and sweat into that. I finally got it. And right now I'm in talks with 6 different biotech companies about getting on the market as soon as possible. And one thing that people don't really realize about medical science is, unlike a lot of other sciences, is you actually have to get things through this regulatory process. And that is actually 5 to 10 years in this case. Just because you have to, especially with rare diseases such as pancreatic cancer is considered a rare disease because, for example, in just the US, only 40,000 people will get it every year. However, it's also the 4th leading cause of cancerous death because about 40,000 people also die from it every year in the US. So it has pretty much equal mortality as diagnostic rates. And what happens there is it's very hard to get pancreatic cancer samples. And if you want these samples, if you work at Johns Hopkins, you might have like around I think 500 blood samples. However, for a large clinical scale trial, you need about 10,000, 20,000 samples. So that means you're going to have to buy them. So each sample costs $5,000 for a few drops of blood. And that's because of this one Supreme Court hearing that we had, I think 30 years ago, that says that doctors don't own your samples. So let's say you go to the hospital and you say you unfortunately have cancer, but as you're dying, you want to help broaden the field. So you donate a sample to your doctor in hopes that they can advance it so that no one else will have to go through this. Well, the doctor doesn't actually own that. The institute that he works at owns it. And then they can sell your sample for $5,000 to whoever they really choose. And so we have a bit of a moral conflict there as well. And so just getting it through the regulatory process is, just in one country, is first a hurdle. And just in the US, it's going to be several $1 million. And then to get it internationally, you have to go through each and every country's regulatory process. And so that entails probably about a couple $100 million in order to roll out this in a lot of different places. And so that's one of the main challenges that we face with really bringing this everywhere. My dream for this was to democratize health diagnostics because it costs 3 cents. I mean, that's pennies, such that anyone could afford to have the exact same standard of healthcare diagnostics. However, with these medical regulatory procedures, it becomes really cost inhibitive and prevents that democratization. So what we should really strive for in the next few years probably is a universal health regulatory system such that you don't have to go country by country by country. Instead, everyone could agree, okay, this test works, and so then we can all use it and thus have the exact same access to health because also health should be a basic human right, in my opinion. I mean, we all deserve the right to be healthy. So,
thank you so much, Jack. Thank you so much. Just to lead the question time, if I may, if I have the correct understanding, you're able to measure the presence, or detect the presence of cancer because of the physical change in the shape of the carbon nanotube. Is that a good deduction?
yeah, so essentially what happens is, let's say you have this protein in your bloodstream. What will happen is the protein will go into this network of nanotubes, and it will slam into this antibody, and it will form this larger molecule. And when this larger molecule forms, it kind of spreads all these nanotubes apart and creates a larger gap between them. And so you can imagine it like you have a big bundle of wires, and you kind of are ripping it apart. And when that happens, there are less connections. And when there are less connections, it's harder for electricity to flow through that since there are less pathways for it to take. And so I'm measuring that change in how hard it is for electricity to flow through it.
Does that mean, therefore, that your test could measure theoretically almost any disease?
Yeah, precisely, because you just switch out that antibody, detect an entirely different protein, pretty much any disease for 3 cents.
Amazing, amazing.